They sold a girl like a sack of salt and called it destiny. But destiny does not shout. It whispers to the stubborn hearts that refuse to die. In the green hush of Kijani Forest, a cart creaked, a hunter drank, and a silent bride learned the language of smoke, leaf, and ember. With bare hands and an unbroken gaze, Zara turned hunger into flavor, fear into fire, and gossip into the drumbeat of her rise. When envy circled and sickness struck, she answered with skill, not spite. And on the day the village tried to measure her worth, she measured herself and found no debts left to pay. This is not a tale of magic. It is the arithmetic of dignity, one woman, one craft, multiplied by courage. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Drop your location and local time below. If you love stories of resilience and redemption, hit subscribe to stay with us through every twist. The morning Zara was taken away, the sky was pale with a thin mist, as if even the heavens hesitated to look too clearly at what was happening. In Riverbend, a village forgotten by fortune debts weighed heavier than affection. Zara's father stood by the creaky cart, his face locked in a mask of false urgency, pretending to busy himself with the ropes, so he would not meet her eyes. Her mother, hands folded in her lap, sat motionless on the doorstep as though her spirit had already surrendered. Zara emerged quietly, carrying a small bundle wrapped in a faded cloth, one worn dress, a cracked gourd of water, and a pair of sandals whose soles had long thinned out. No dowry, no blessing, not even a smile. As she stepped onto the cart, her scarf slipped from her head and fluttered into the dirt. The wind carried it away like a piece of her vanishing youth. No one bent to pick it up. Not her father, not her mother, not even the aunt leaning against the cashew tree. The cart groaned forward. Villagers stood at their gates in silence, watching as Zara was carted off, not like a bride, but like a debt payment. Old Mama Tano, who always spoke louder than necessary, muttered for everyone to hear, "She'll become nothing but the hunter's shadow." And yet no one corrected her because everyone believed it was true. Zara sat straight, her eyes dry. She did not cry, did not scream, did not plead. Her body moved with the cart, but her soul clung to the village fence posts, watching from afar. She felt the silence of abandonment cut deeper than any blade. As the cart rolled past the round stone where children once played, a strange hush fell over the land. The wind shifted. A cloud drifted across the sun, as though even the sky mourned a theft that could not be stopped. By the time they reached Kijani Forest, the air had changed. No laughter from neighbors, no smoke from familiar kitchens, only the heavy breath of trees and the distant calls of wild birds. The hunter Baraka, broad-shouldered with a face hardened by years of isolation, chewed tobacco in silence. He never asked Zara her name, never welcomed her, never acknowledged that she was human. He simply steered the cart until they reached a mud and thatch hut deep in the clearing. Baraka pointed at the hut and walked away. Zara entered hesitantly. The floor was packed dirt. The roof leaked in one corner. A thin mat lay stretched near a fire, reduced to weak embers. This was not a home. It was a cage. That night, Baraka drank from a bottle of kachaka until his body collapsed onto the mat, his snores thunderous and choking. Zara lay by the fire, with only a thin cloth tears slipping silently into the dust. Her weeping was swallowed by the forest, for there was no one to hear, no one to care. The days that followed pressed against her like weights on her chest. Baraka left each morning with a bow and machete slung across his back, returning at dusk with dead game and the stench of sweat and blood. He never spoke to her beyond grunts of command. He never looked at her as a wife, only as another object in his possession, like a clay pot or a wooden stool. One morning Zara carried a clay pot to the river. Her hands trembled as she dipped it into the current. The pot slipped, struck a stone, and cracked. That evening, Baraka discovered the broken vessel. He seized her arm, yanked her close, and struck her cheek with the back of his hand. Pain flared up her neck, burning into her soul. He did not apologize, did not shout. He simply turned his back and went to bed, as though breaking her spirit was no different than breaking a twig. Zara collapsed to her knees, eyes fixed on the shattered pot, and understood no one was coming to save her. If she was to endure, she would have to find a strength deeper than fear. In the days that followed, Zara moved like a shadow, yet something within her resisted. She rose before dawn, washed her face in the river, rubbed castor leaves on her aching arm, and returned to cook, sweep, and tend the hut. She said nothing, but her silence was not submission, it was observation. She listened to the forest, the rhythm of bird calls, the whisper of leaves, the smell of bark steeped in water. The forest spoke in ways people ignored, and she began to understand its language. Weeks passed. The bruise on her cheek faded, but the mark on her heart deepened. Yet from that mark sprouted a seed of resolve. Zara noticed the patterns of the hunter's traps, the scent of leather on his ropes, the timing of when smoke preserved meat best. She realized that survival meant paying attention. While Baraka drank, she learned. While he slept, she watched. Her silence grew into a reservoir of knowledge, waiting for the moment it could pour forth. At the river, other women from scattered huts gathered to wash clothes. They laughed, gossiped, and shared tales of children and husbands. Zara stayed quiet, her hands steady on the stones. One afternoon, as she wrung out a blouse, something unexpected happened. A laugh escaped her lips, small, quick, almost foreign. The women froze. Old Mama Belle, the eldest among them, stared at Zara and whispered, "That's the first time I've seen you laugh." The moment hung in the air like a fragile jewel. Zara smiled faintly and answered, "I didn't even remember what my laugh sounded like." The river carried her words downstream, as though delivering a secret back to the earth. From that day, Zara was no longer invisible to the women. They began to notice the sharpness in her eyes, the steadiness in her hands. One evening, Baraka stumbled home, drunk, tossing a half-skinned gazelle onto the dirt. Zara watched him snore, then quietly finished the work. She cleaned the carcass, rubbed it with ash and forest leaves, and hung it carefully above the fire. She studied the smoke's color, adjusted the wood, and noted how the meat slowly transformed. Within weeks, she mastered the technique, learning to wrap the meat in banana leaves so it kept its flavor longer. When she brought some to Moyo Market under the pretense of fulfilling her husband's orders, she returned with her bundle filled with soap, salt, and fabric, a secret treasure she hid beneath her mat. The hunter never noticed. He thought it came from the garden or neighbors' favors, but Zara knew differently. With each trade, each coin tucked into a clay pot buried behind the hut, she was quietly building a new world. At night, when the hunter drank himself to sleep, Zara sat by the fire drawing lines in the dirt with a piece of charcoal. She calculated how many strips of smoked meat she could prepare in a week, how much soap and fabric they could bring, and how many coins she might hide. Every mark in the dirt was not just a plan but a declaration. She would not remain a shadow. The forest that once swallowed her cries now became her ally. It offered her herbs to heal smoke, to preserve silence, to plan. Slowly, steadily, Zara began to rise, not loudly, not suddenly, but like a root pushing through stone. No one noticed yet, but she knew. Because survival had transformed into something greater, the first quiet steps toward power. The forest had its own clock, and Zara was beginning to tell time by its whispers. Morning was not the chime of bells, but the first shift of the mist. Noon was the way shadows grew short and heavy, and night was when the silence thickened until even the crickets fell quiet. She no longer thought in hours or days. She thought in cycles of smoke, in patterns of birds, in the rhythm of survival. Each dawn, while Baraka slept with his bottle clutched to his chest, Zara rose barefoot, her body tired but her spirit restless. She would fetch water, sweep the yard, and study the plants growing wild around the hut. At first she only saw leaves, but soon she began to notice the differences. Some leaves were smooth, others rough. Some carried a sharp scent when rubbed between her fingers, others bled sap that made her skin tingle. She remembered the time her arms swelled after a slap, and how castor leaves cooled the heat. Now she tested each leaf, whispering to herself like a student learning a secret language. She listened not only with her ears, but with her body. The forest spoke in subtle ways. The sound of branches cracking revealed which animal had passed. The smell of wet bark told her if rain was close. Even the silence spoke, warning her when danger crouched unseen. Fear had once paralyzed her. Now it sharpened her. She realized that to survive, she must learn to hear what others ignored. One evening, Baraka came home earlier than usual. His hands stank of blood, and he carried a half-dead antelope slung over his shoulders. He dropped it on the floor with a grunt. Without waiting, he poured himself drink after drink until his eyes grew glassy. Zara watched silently, waiting for him to fall into the usual stupor. When he did, she dragged the animal outside and studied it. The skin, the smell, the freshness of the meat, every detail etched itself into her mind. She washed the carcass, rubbed it with ashes and leaves, then hung it above the smoking rack. That night she stayed awake to observe the smoke. Thin smoke meant the fire was too weak. Thick smoke meant the meat would taste bitter. She adjusted the wood, shifting the logs until the smoke curled evenly. By dawn, the meat had taken on a rich golden hue. When she tasted it, she felt pride bloom inside her. It was tender, flavored with the essence of the forest. She knew then that she had discovered something important, something that could not be beaten out of her or stolen by silence. It was hers. At the river, while other women gossiped, Zara began to pay attention to more than their words. She noticed which leaves they used to scrub stains, which stones they chose for grinding, which herbs they carried in small bundles tied with string. Though they spoke carelessly, Zara listened carefully. She pieced together knowledge from fragments, adding it to the growing library in her mind. One day Mama Belle, the elder who had once remarked on her laughter, approached her quietly. "Child," she said, her voice low, "I see the way you look at the forest. You are not blind like the others." "Do you know what that means?" Zara shook her head. Belle leaned closer. "It means the forest is teaching you. Do not ignore its lessons. They will save you when people will not." Zara carried those words like a hidden weapon. That night, as Baraka snored and the fire flickered low, she whispered them to herself over and over. She realized that she was not just surviving anymore, she was preparing for what she did not yet know. But something was shifting inside her, something that could not be silenced forever. Weeks turned into months. Zara's hands grew skilled. She learned to strip bark for tea, to mix herbs, to ease fever, to time the smoke so the meat lasted longer. She still lowered her eyes when Baraka barked orders, but inside she was changing. The bruise on her arm had faded, but the memory of that night burned brighter than ever. She would never forget the moment she realized no one was coming to rescue her. That realization, painful as it was, had planted the seed of defiance. Her silence was no longer weakness, it was armor. Baraka mistook her quiet for obedience. He did not notice that her back was straighter now that her eyes stayed open longer at night, that her hands worked with a steadiness he could not break. He thought she was still a shadow. But shadows can grow long and reach places the light cannot. One afternoon, Zara returned from the river carrying clothes when she noticed two children chasing each other near the edge of the clearing. They froze when they saw her. Children were often warned not to approach the hunter's hut. Fear clung to Baraka's name like a curse. But Zara smiled softly. She bent down and offered them a strip of smoked meat she had hidden in her cloth. The children accepted hesitantly, then ran off giggling. That was the first time Zara realized that others were watching her, even from afar. Not long after, a traveler from the town stopped at the hut. He was hungry and Baraka, too drunk to move, grunted for Zara to deal with him. Zara quietly offered the traveler a piece of her smoked meat. He tasted it, eyes widening. This is unlike anything I've ever eaten," he exclaimed. "How did you make this?" Zara only smiled faintly, lowering her gaze. He left with more meat wrapped in banana leaves, promising to return. And he did. A week later, he came back with coins and goods to trade. That night, Zara sat by the fire staring at the coins in her palm. For the first time, she felt the weight of possibility. Her chest tightened, not with fear, but with anticipation. She buried the coins in a clay pot, sealed it with wax, and hid it beneath a loose stone near the cassava patch. As she covered it with soil, she whispered to herself, "One day this will be my freedom." Baraka never asked questions. He saw the soap, the fabric, the salt, and assumed it was luck or favors. He was too wrapped in his drink to notice the shift happening under his own roof. Zara, however, felt it in every breath. She was no longer only surviving, she was building. Still, the forest tested her resolve. One evening, as she prepared to hang strips of meat, a sudden storm swept through. The wind tore at the thatched roof and rain threatened to ruin the fire. Zara fought to shield the rack, her hands burning from the smoke, her body drenched. She managed to save half of the batch, but the rest spoiled. That night, Baraka struck her again, blaming her for the loss. But Zara did not cry. She pressed her swollen lips, stared into the fire, and thought, "Even storms cannot stop me. If I can survive this, I can survive anything." The next morning, she woke earlier than ever. She rebuilt the rack stronger this time, with stones anchoring the structure and vines woven tighter. She gathered leaves that repelled insects, herbs that kept the meat fresh. Every mistake became a lesson, every pain became a teacher. Slowly, Zara was turning her suffering into skill. And though no one in the village knew it, yet a silent transformation was underway. A woman once sold as a debt was becoming a force that no silence, no slap, no storm could erase. The market of Moyo was never silent. Even before the sun rose fully above the clay roofs, vendors' voices filled the air like a choir of survival. Women calling out prices of cassava, men slapping fish against wooden boards, children darting between baskets of fruit with sticky fingers. For Zara, stepping into the market was stepping into another world. It was the first place outside the forest where she could test the fragile wings of the knowledge she had gathered in silence. That morning, she carried a small bundle wrapped in banana leaves. Inside were strips of smoked meat, each one prepared with careful attention, each wrapped and tied with palm fiber. She walked with her eyes lowered, but her steps were steady. People recognized her at once. They whispered, "That's the hunter's wife, the girl who never speaks." Some smirked, others looked away. Zara pretended not to hear. She had learned that whispers cannot stop you unless you bend your ear toward them. She found a spot at the far edge of the market near a row of baskets filled with firewood. She laid her bundle down, unwrapped the leaves, and let the scent rise into the air. At first, no one approached. The women selling yams chuckled to themselves. The man selling soap didn't even glance her way. Zara sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Then, as if guided by the forest itself, a man with dust on his shoes and hunger in his eyes stopped. He was a traveler, a messenger from the town beyond the river. "What's that smell?" he asked. Zara did not answer immediately. She only gestured to the strips of meat. The man picked one up, took a bite, and his eyes widened. "By the ancestors, this is unlike anything I've ever tasted." He bought all that she had, leaving behind a small stack of coins. Zaha tucked them quickly into her bundle, her heart pounding. She returned home before Baraka. She hid the coins in a clay pot she had buried behind the hut, sealing it with wax and covering it with stones. Each coin felt heavier than gold, not because of its value, but because it represented possibility. For the first time, Zara felt she was not only surviving but planting seeds of her own destiny. Over the following weeks, she repeated the cycle. She smoked the meat with care, wrapped it in banana leaves, carried it to Moyo Market, and sold it quietly. Each time, more people returned. Some came with soap to trade, others with fabric, others with salt. Zara's bundle grew heavier with goods, and her hidden pots multiplied. But with success came scrutiny. The women at the river began to ask questions. "What leaf do you use for the smoke? How does your meat stay fresh so long?" Zara smiled softly and changed the subject. She was not unkind, but she knew that her knowledge was her shield. In a world where poor women were easily forgotten, secrets could mean survival. One day, as she set up her small display at the market, Madame Kunda, a wealthy spice merchant, walked by. Madame Kunda was known for her sharp tongue and sharper eyes. She sold imported goods, spices, fine cloth, and ornaments, and was used to being the most sought-after woman in Moyo Market. She stopped in front of Zara's stall, her nose twitching at the smell of smoked meat. "Too good," she said loudly, so everyone nearby could hear. "This meat smells too good to be ordinary. Perhaps she uses charms. Perhaps it's not from God." The words dropped like stones into the crowd. Some people laughed nervously, others frowned. Zahra did not answer. She lowered her gaze and continued to wrap her meat, but inside her chest tightened. She knew envy when she saw it, and envy was as dangerous as hunger. That evening, she walked home slowly. At the hut, she found Baraka already drunk, sprawled across the mat. He grunted when he saw her, but asked no questions. Zara lit the fire and sat in silence, her mind replaying Madame Kunda's words. "They will try to poison my name," she thought, "but I must not let their noise drown out my work." The next morning she woke earlier than usual. She rebuilt her smoking rack stronger and cleaner and experimented with new blends of herbs. She tested different woods, different leaves, until the smoke carried a sweetness that clung to the meat without overpowering it. She took notes in the dirt with a stick, marking what worked and what failed, erasing and redrawing as she learned. One afternoon, while tending her rack, she heard footsteps behind her. It was Juma, the village elder. His beard was gray, his back slightly bent, but his eyes were sharp. He sat on a log without speaking. Zara offered him water in a gourd. He sipped slowly, then looked at the rack of meat, the swept yard, the clay pots neatly arranged. Finally, he said, "They say you rose too quickly. They say your knowledge comes from nowhere." Zara stayed silent, her hands steady as she turned the meat. The elder reached into his tunic and pulled out a necklace made of animal teeth, worn and smooth with age. He laid it at her feet. "My grandmother used to say," he murmured, "that quiet wisdom comes from an old soul. I don't know what you do, but I know you are not harming anyone. Remember, envy makes noise. Truth grows in silence." With that, he stood and left. Zara picked up the necklace, her eyes glistening. It was the first time someone had openly acknowledged her worth without suspicion. She tied the necklace around her wrist as a reminder that not all eyes saw only malice. But Madame Kunda did not stop. The following week, whispers spread faster. Some villagers muttered that Zara bathed in special herbs to attract customers. Others said she buried coins at crossroads for luck. None of it was true, but lies travel faster than truth. Zara remained calm. She did not defend herself, did not waste time arguing. She poured her energy into her craft. When the traveler from town returned, he brought not only money but also friends. "This is the woman," he told them, pointing to Zara. Her meat tastes like no other. You must try it. Soon Zara's customers grew beyond the village. Coins filled her clay pots. Her bundle returned heavier from the market each week. Yet at home, Baraka still drank and snarled, blind to the empire growing under his own roof. He ate the food Zara prepared without question, wore the clean clothes she bartered for without realizing their origin. He never asked where the goods came from, never noticed the way Zara's back straightened or the light that had returned to her eyes. One night, as Zara buried another pot of coins beneath the cassava plants, she whispered to herself, "Knowledge is my shield. Patience is my weapon. Silence is my ally." She pressed the soil firmly, her hands steady. She was no longer the girl who had climbed onto a cart with empty eyes. She was becoming something more, something no slap, no rumor, no silence could erase. And in Moyo Market, though, Madame Kunda continued to cast shadows, Zara's light was beginning to shine through. People came not because of charms, but because they trusted what their tongues told them. The taste of her smoked meat carried the truth. And truth once planted cannot be buried forever. The market of Moyo had always been a battlefield of whispers, but now Zara's name floated through it like smoke, thick, undeniable, impossible to grasp fully. Some spoke with admiration, "That hunter's wife, she makes meat taste like no other." Others spoke with suspicion, "No poor woman rises that fast without help from the spirits." Every coin Zara earned, every strip of smoked meat she sold, was not only a victory but also a spark that lit envy in the hearts of those who had once believed she would disappear into the forest as a forgotten shadow. And at the center of that envy was Madame Kunda. Madame Kunda had ruled Moyo Market for years. She was the woman everyone came to when they wanted spices to impress a guest or fine cloth to stitch a wedding dress. She loved being the center, the one who lent, who set prices, who extended credit with a smile that always cost more than the goods themselves. But lately she had begun to notice her regular customers drifting. Men who once bought her spices now spent their coins on Zara's meat. Women who once praised her imported cloth now saved their money for Zara's soap, the kind that cleaned without cracking their hands. At first Kunda laughed it off. "It will pass," she said to herself. "The village loves a new thing, but soon they will return." Yet weeks passed, and instead of fading, Zara's reputation grew. The traveler from town returned again, this time with his wife, who declared that she would no longer cook without Zara's smoked meat. Others followed, eager to taste what had become the new talk of the market. Kunda's smile hardened. She could not allow herself to lose status, not to a woman who had entered the market with nothing but silence and leaves. And so one Saturday morning, as the market bustled with life, she made her move. Standing tall in her stall, dressed in brightly patterned cloth, Madame Kunda raised her voice so all could hear. "People of Moyo," she cried, "be careful what you eat and be careful whom you trust. Some meats carry more than flavor. Some hands carry more than honesty." The market quieted, all eyes turning to her. She pointed toward Zara's modest display at the edge of the square. "She rose too quickly. She sells more than meat. I say there is magic in those leaves, charms hidden in that smoke. Do you think such success is natural? No, it is witchcraft, and witchcraft is not from God." The words dropped like stones in a still pond. Murmurs spread. Some villagers shook their heads. Others stepped back from Zara's stall. Suspicion is a shadow that clings fast, and Zara felt its weight settle upon her shoulders. But she did not flinch. She did not shout back. She simply tied her bundle tighter and looked down, her face calm as riverstone. That night, Zara walked home slower than usual. Her chest burned with unspoken words. In the hut, Baraka lay drunk, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. Zara sat by the fire, staring into the flames. "If they believe her lies, everything I've built will crumble," she thought. But truth does not shout. Truth endures. The next morning, Zara rose earlier than ever. She rebuilt her smoking rack this time, laying stones at the base to keep it steady, binding the poles with vines so tight they would not shift. She chose her wood carefully, selecting only the branches that burned evenly. She added new herbs she had tested in silence: wild thyme, a leaf with a sharp citrus scent bark that gave the smoke a sweet undertone. The meat that emerged carried a fragrance so rich it lingered in the air long after she wrapped it in banana leaves. When she carried it to Moyo Market, she did not speak. She let the scent do the talking. Customers approached, hesitant at first, then drawn in. They tasted, and once again their faces lit with surprise. "This is no magic," one woman said, licking her fingers. "This is skill. But rumors are like weeds, easy to spread, hard to kill." Whispers continued. Zara began to notice longer stares, sharper questions. Where did you learn this? Who taught you these herbs? Are you sure there's no midwife in your family line? Each question carried suspicion, each glance weighed with doubt. Zara answered with silence and steady hands. It was then that Elder Juma appeared again. One misty morning, Zara found him sitting quietly on the log outside her hut. He had come alone, walking slowly with his cane. Zara greeted him with water and waited. He set the gourd down and said, "They are afraid of you, child, afraid because you have found a strength they cannot name. They do not understand, and what people do not understand they call evil." Zara lowered her eyes, her fingers tightening around the gourd. The elder removed the necklace of animal teeth from his neck, the same one his grandmother had once worn. He placed it at her feet. "My grandmother told me that wisdom which grows in silence belongs to an old soul. Keep your silence, Zara, but let your work speak louder than any rumor. The truth will root itself deeper than lies." He left without another word, his footprints fading into the mist. Zara picked up the necklace, tears stinging her eyes. She tied it around her wrist, not as jewelry but as a reminder that at least one pair of eyes saw her clearly. Encouraged, Zara threw herself into her work with renewed focus. She began to teach herself more, experimenting with new combinations of herbs, refining the smoking process until her meat was unmatched in flavor and longevity. She also started making soap from ash and oil, wrapping each bar in leaves, offering them alongside the meat. The women who bought her soap returned their hands no longer cracked their clothes, smelling faintly of lavender from the herbs Zara mixed in. Customers came back not only because of taste, but because of trust. They could feel the care in her hands, the patience in her process. Even those who had doubted began to soften. But Madame Kunda was not finished. She began sending her nephews to stand near Zara's stall, spreading whispers. She buries coins at the crossroads. She prays to the spirits at night. She boils herbs under the moon. Each lie twisted like a snake through the crowd. And though Zara sold well, she could feel the tension growing. At home, Baraka still remained blind. He thought the house smelled better, the food tasted richer, but he never once asked why. He staggered through each day, bottle in hand, never realizing that the woman he had dragged into his hut like a payment was now quietly weaving a kingdom around him. One night, Zara buried yet another clay pot of coins near the cassava plant. She pressed the soil down and whispered, "Every coin is a seed. Seeds grow no matter how deep the shadows." And though Madame Kunda's voice still rang in the market, Zara knew no rumor, no envy, no silence could stop what had already taken root. Because knowledge once planted does not die. It grows quietly until even those who doubt must stand in its shade. The rains came early that year. They beat against the thatched roof of the hut, turning the yard into a patchwork of mud and puddles. The forest smelled of wet bark and new growth, but inside Baraka's hut, the air smelled of sickness. One evening, after stumbling back from a failed hunt, Baraka collapsed onto the dirt floor, his skin clammy, his breath shallow. He groaned like an injured animal clutching at his chest. For the first time since Zara had been brought to his hut, the mighty hunter looked small. Zara froze. For years he had been a shadow over her life, his hand, the one that struck, his voice, the one that commanded. Now that same man lay before her, too weak to rise, his eyes dull with fever. She could have turned away. She could have left him to sweat and shake until death took him. But Zara's hands moved on their own. She fetched water, wiped his forehead with a cloth, and lit herbs to keep mosquitoes at bay. She boiled bitter roots, crushed neem leaves, and slipped them beneath his pillow. For 3 days and nights, Zara scarcely slept. She tended him with the same patience she gave to her smoking rack, measuring each dose of herbs, listening to his breathing, as if the forest itself had taught her to hear life from silence. By the third night, the fever broke. Baraka opened his eyes and stared at her, not as one looks at a possession, but as one looks at a human being. He did not speak, but the fear in his gaze had softened into something like humility. As Baraka lay recovering, another figure appeared at the edge of Zara's life. One morning, while she carried laundry to the river, she saw a man sitting by the trail. His clothes were torn, his feet swollen from travel. She recognized him instantly, her father. The world seemed to tilt. Memories rushed back the day he stood beside the cart, pretending to be busy, avoiding her eyes, selling her like a goat to settle his debts. Now here he was, thin and weary, his sack empty, his face sunken with regret. Zara froze. Her heart pounded, anger and sorrow battling inside her chest. Her father lifted his head slowly. "Zara," his voice cracked. But the words died. He looked at her bundle of clothes, at her straight back, at the calmness in her face, and his mouth trembled. Zara said nothing at first. She laid out a mat for him, fetched water, and placed a bowl of porridge before him. On top, she sprinkled crushed peanuts, just as she remembered he once liked. When he lifted the spoon to his lips, his eyes filled with tears. He tried to eat, but his hands shook too much. Finally, he set the bowl down and whispered, "The daughter I sold now feeds me with dignity I cannot buy." The silence between them was thick. Zara did not cry. She did not shout. She only nodded her expression, steady her heart both heavy and light. She had no words to erase the past, but she had no desire to carry its weight forever. Her father rose slowly, saying, "I will not burden you." Zara did not stop him. She only looked at him the way one looks at a tree that no longer bears fruit but still casts shade. He walked away with the empty bowl, his back bent not only by years but by regret. Back at the hut, Baraka began to recover. He could sit in the sun again, speak in short sentences, but the sickness had broken something inside him. He no longer barked orders with the same authority. He watched Zara move about the hut with new eyes that saw her not as an object, but as the steady force that had kept him alive. Shame flickered across his face when their gazes met, though he never found the words to confess it. Meanwhile, rumors in the village continued to spread. Madame Kunda had not forgotten her campaign to poison Zara's name. Some said Zara's healing skills proved she was a witch. Others whispered that her father's sudden reappearance was proof of dark dealings. But Zara remained calm. She did not waste time answering accusations. She knew every moment spent defending herself was a moment stolen from growth. Instead, Zara poured her energy into her craft. She began experimenting with new blends of herbs, creating soaps that carried the scents of lemongrass and lavender. She wrapped each bar in banana leaves tied with palm fiber. Women who bought them returned with softer hands and brighter smiles. Zara also refined her smoked meat process, building a stronger rack and marking recipes with charcoal symbols on clay pots so she would not forget. It was during this time that a young girl appeared in her life. Amara was an orphan, barely 10 years old, her eyes wide with both fear and curiosity. Zara found her lingering at the edge of the clearing one evening, staring at the smoke rising from the rack. When Zara approached, the girl did not run. Instead, she whispered, "Can I help?" Zara studied her for a moment. She saw herself in the child, the same silence, the same hunger for belonging. She handed Amara a bundle of leaves and showed her how to tie them around strips of meat. From that day, Amara returned each morning, eager to learn. Slowly, Zara began teaching her not only how to smoke meat, but also how to prepare soap, how to identify useful herbs, how to read the forest signs. In Amara, Zara found not just a helper, but a reflection of the hope she had once thought lost. One evening, as she watched Amara carefully stirring a pot of oil and ash, Zara felt something swell in her chest. For years, she had been only a shadow in Baraka's hut, invisible to her family, forgotten by her village. But now, through her hands, she was shaping not just goods to trade, but lives to nurture. She was no longer a silent wife surviving in a cage. She was a teacher, a builder, a root that would not be pulled up. That night, when she buried yet another clay pot of coins in the earth, Zara pressed her palm to the soil and whispered, "This is not only for me. This is for every girl they think is powerless. This is for Amara. This is for the silence that has waited too long to be heard." The moon shone down through the trees, and for the first time Zara felt not only the weight of her struggles, but also the weight of her strength. She had healed the man who once hurt her. She had fed the father who once abandoned her. She had planted seeds in the heart of a child who had nothing. And in doing so, she had proven that even in the darkest soil, dignity could bloom. The dry season arrived like a sharp blade, cutting the forest into brittle shades of yellow and brown. Streams thinned into trickles and the ground cracked under the weight of heat. Yet from Zara's yard, smoke continued to rise steady and fragrant. Word had spread beyond Moyo. Market travelers from other villages sought her smoked meat, her herbal soap, and even advice for fevers and wounds. What had begun as a survival skill was turning into something larger, a quiet empire built on patience and fire. But Madame Kunda's envy had also grown with the season. The more Zara prospered, the more restless Kunda became. She could not bear to see her stall, ignored her spices left untouched, while crowds gathered near the quiet hunter's wife, and so she chose a darker path. One evening under a new moon, Kunda sent her nephews, 2 men with sly eyes and hungry pockets, into the forest. Their task was simple: ruin Zara's smoking racks. They crept into the clearing where Zara's hut stood, silent as snakes. They kicked at the racks, scattering the meat into the dirt, and toppled the wooden frame so that it splintered against the stones. Satisfied with their destruction, they vanished into the trees. By dawn, Zara stepped outside to find the racks broken, the meat spoiled the yard, littered with ash and dust. For a moment, her heart clenched. Weeks of work days, of careful smoking, all gone. Behind her, Baraka, still weak from illness, leaned against the doorway watching silently. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but closed it again, shame darkening his face. Zara did not cry. She knelt beside the wreckage, picked up one of the ruined strips of meat, and studied it carefully. Then she stood, brushed the dirt from her dress, and said softly, "If they destroy once, I will build twice." With Amara by her side, she set to work. Together they cleared the wreckage, salvaging what little they could. Then Zara led the girl into the forest. "We will not rebuild the same," she explained. "We will build stronger." She gathered bamboo poles thicker than before and vines tougher than rope. She chose a new location near a cluster of stones that shielded the racks from the wind. By nightfall, the new structure stood tall, an improved design, fortified with clay at the base, and anchored by logs so heavy no foot could topple them. The first fire they lit beneath it burned slow and steady, the smoke curling upward like a promise. Zara added a secret blend of herbs she had discovered in her walk's leaves that released a sweet, earthy fragrance when burned. The meat hung above the smoke took on a flavor richer than ever before. Even Amara, chewing a small strip, widened her eyes. "It tastes like the forest itself," she whispered. When Zara carried her goods to Moyo Market again, people gasped at the aroma. Customers returned not only to buy but to ask questions. "How does it keep so fresh? What leaves are these? Can you teach me?" Zara smiled faintly and handed over the meat without revealing her secret. But inside she knew this was the answer to destruction. When others tried to tear her down, she rose stronger. That week she also introduced something new. Using ash oil and herbs, she created bars of soap that smelled of wild lavender and lemongrass. Wrapped in banana leaves tied with palm fibers, the soap looked as natural as it smelled. She offered them alongside her meat. Women who bought them returned weeks later praising how their hands no longer cracked, how their children's skin healed from rashes. Zara's reputation grew not just as a seller of goods, but as a healer, a woman of knowledge. Still, Zara did not forget the danger. She knew Madame Kunda would not stop easily. That is why she began teaching Amara, more seriously treating her like an apprentice. She showed the girl how to identify herbs by scent and texture, how to balance the fire's heat, so the smoke flavored without burning, how to mix oil and ash in just the right measure. At night, she even taught her how to mark recipes using symbols in the dirt. "Why do you teach me everything?" Amara asked one evening, her small hands blackened from ash. Zara looked at her with steady eyes. "Because knowledge is the only treasure no one can steal. If I fall, it must live on in you." That night, Zahra dug up one of her clay pots filled with coins. She counted carefully, dividing what she had saved. With part of it, she planned something bold, to buy a small plot of land near the river, a place she could expand her work beyond the shadow of Baraka's hut. The following week, she approached old Musa, a farmer too weak to tend his fields. His land by the river had grown wild weeds climbing over the soil. "I will give you meat every week for a year," Zara said softly, "if you give me the right to use your field." Musa studied her with tired eyes, then nodded. "Better you use it than let it die," he replied. With a handshake, the deal was sealed. Zara's vision widened. On the new land, she began building a larger rack this time, with help from other women who admired her resilience. At first, they came only to watch, curious about how she had risen. But soon they began asking to learn. Zara taught them patiently, showing them how to smoke meat, how to make soap, how to dry herbs for medicine. She organized them into a small group, each woman contributing and each earning a share. It was Amara who suggested the name. "Zara's Smoke and Soap," she said proudly, holding up a bar of freshly wrapped lavender soap. Zara laughed softly, but the name spread among the women, and soon even customers at the market used it. Business grew. Zara's goods reached not only Moyo Market but also neighboring villages. Travelers carried her soap wrapped in leaves, her meat tied in fiber, spreading her name like a story whispered from mouth to mouth. And though rumors still lingered, they began to fade against the weight of truth. People could taste the difference, feel the results, see the change in their lives. Yet Madame Kunda, watching her stall grow emptier each week, seethed. She had thrown stones, spread lies, even sent saboteurs, and still Zara had risen higher. Her envy boiled into desperation. "If she will not fall by whispers," Kunda muttered to herself, "then I will bring the law down upon her head." But Zara, though she did not yet know the storm Kunda was preparing, had already armed herself, not with curses or vengeance, but with knowledge, community, and dignity. She had turned one ruined rack into a stronger empire, one orphan into a student, one plot of land into the beginning of a cooperative. That evening, as she watched the smoke curl into the twilight sky, Zara felt Amara slip her small hand into hers. "You're not just surviving anymore," the girl whispered. "You're teaching us all how to live." Zara squeezed her hand gently. "Remember this, child, storms will come, envy will strike, but roots that grow deep cannot be pulled out. We are planting roots." And with that, the smoke rose higher, carrying not only the scent of meat and herbs, but the promise of a future no rumor could destroy. The river glistened under the afternoon sun, its waters carrying whispers of promise. On the far bank, Zara stood surveying the small plot of land she had secured from old Musa. Once neglected and overrun with weeds, it now seemed to pulse with possibility. The earth was dark and fertile, the kind of soil that, if cared for, could feed not only bodies but destinies. Zara pressed her toes into the damp soil and whispered, "This land will grow more than food, it will grow freedom." With Amara at her side and 3 other women from the village who had quietly approached her, Zara began to transform the field. They cleared weeds, built a larger smoking rack fortified with stones, and set up clay pots for storing herbs. They also dug a shallow pit lined with stones where soap could be cooked in bigger batches than Zara's tiny hut had ever allowed. At first the women came hesitantly. They had heard whispers about Zara, some still half believed the rumors of charms and witchcraft, but their hunger for change was stronger than fear. One of them, Ayo, admitted that her husband had squandered their earnings on drink. Another, Miriam, said she was tired of depending on credit from Madame Kunda's stall. "If you will teach us," Miriam said, "we will work with you." Zara nodded, her voice calm but firm. "Here no one works for pity, we work for value. What you learn, what you make, will bring back dignity to your own hands. No woman here is a beggar, we are builders." And so the cooperative was born. Zara did not give it a grand name, she simply called it Our Work. Yet within weeks, it became more than that. Each woman had a role. Amara managed the fire, Ayo learned to cut and wrap the meat, Miriam mastered the soap mixture, while Zara guided them all, her eyes sharp, her hands steady. The work was not easy. The smoke stung their eyes, the fires burned their arms, and the scent of herbs clung stubbornly to their clothes. Yet for the first time, they laughed while working. They teased one another, shared secrets, and sang old songs to the rhythm of chopping and stirring. Zara herself began to smile more often, though always with that quiet dignity that had carried her through so much. At the market, their stall grew. No longer was it just Zara with a small bundle. Now there was a table covered with woven mats, displaying strips of smoked meat, neat stacks of soap, wrapped in banana leaves, and bundles of dried herbs, tied with palm fiber. Customers flocked. Travelers came asking specifically for Zara's products. Even men, once skeptical, admitted that the soap lasted longer and the meat traveled better than anything else in the market. Soon people began calling it by a name Amara had whispered weeks earlier, Zara's smoke and soap. With growth came challenges. Madame Kunda, furious at seeing her influence shrink, refused to greet Zara at the market. Her stall, once the centerpiece, now sat ignored as customers lined up at Zara's table. "This cannot last," Kunda muttered to herself, watching Zara's steady hands measure coins and trade with a quiet smile. But Zara was not seeking to shame anyone. In fact, she extended her hand to other women. When asked if she feared teaching too much, she replied, "Knowledge kept to oneself rots. Shared knowledge multiplies." Slowly, women who had once whispered doubts about her began to join the cooperative. Each week, more hands gathered at the riverside field. One evening, Zara held a meeting by the fire. The women sat in a circle, their faces lit by the glow. Zara stood in the center, her voice steady. "We must learn to calculate our worth. Do not sell for pity. Do not lower your price because someone frowns. Sell because your hands have value. If we do not honor our work, no one else will." Amara, eyes bright, asked, "But what if they mock us?" Zara's gaze swept the circle. "Then we stand taller. Because laughter fades, but dignity does not. We are not shadows anymore. We are roots." Her words settled into the women's hearts like seeds. That night, as they walked home under the stars, they carried not just soap and meat, but the weight of new confidence. Business expanded quickly. With the land by the river, Zara introduced a small garden of medicinal plants, neem, lemongrass, castor, and others she had learned to use during Baraka's illness. The women helped cultivate it, watering and weeding together. They began packaging small bundles of herbs for teas and remedies. At the market, these sold out just as quickly as the soap and meat. For the first time, Zara felt her life stretch beyond survival. She saw children running through the cooperative fields, laughing as they fetched water. She saw women walking with straighter backs, no longer begging for credit but carrying coins they had earned. She saw Amara, once an orphan hiding at the edge of the forest, now teaching younger girls how to tie banana leaves without tearing them. One afternoon, Elder Juma visited the river plot. He walked slowly, leaning on his cane, but his eyes shone as he watched the women working together. This land was once forgotten, he said to Zara. Now it hums with life. You have done more than build a business, you have built a future. Zara bowed her head respectfully. I did not build it alone. The forest taught me, pain taught me, and these women walk with me. The elder placed his hand on her shoulder. Remember, child, success will always draw eyes, some kind, some cruel. But truth does not need to shout. Let your work continue to speak. His words proved prophetic. Though Zara's cooperative flourished, Madame Kunda simmered with growing malice. Watching her stall grow emptier each week, Kunda began to plot not with whispers, but with sharper tools, the village law, the council, the weight of authority. If envy could not topple Zara in the market, perhaps power could crush her at the council's table. But Zara, though unaware of Kunda's exact schemes, had already fortified herself. She had more than racks and recipes, now she had community. She had women who would stand beside her children, who called her auntie elders, who acknowledged her wisdom and coins hidden in clay pots that could pay debts if needed. One evening, Zara sat by the river, the sunset painting the water gold. Amara sat beside her, braiding grass into a small rope. Do you ever get afraid? The girl asked suddenly. Zara looked at her. Of course, but fear is like smoke. It can choke you if you sit still, but if you keep moving, it clears. Amara smiled faintly, clutching the rope in her hands. Then we'll keep moving. Zara gazed at the horizon. She knew storms would come again. Envy was a storm, power was a storm, even memory was a storm. But she also knew what storms could not do. They could not uproot roots planted deep. And she and her women had already sunk their roots firmly into the soil of dignity. The smoke from their racks rose higher that evening, carrying with it not just the scent of meat and herbs, but the unspoken message. We are here. We will not vanish. And far away, Madame Kunda watched from her fading stall, her lips pressed thin. If the village cannot stop her, she muttered, then the law will. The air in Riverbend grew thick with unease. Zara's stall at Moyo Market flourished, her cooperative by the river expanded, and her name was carried from one village to the next with respect. But Madame Kunda's jealousy burned hotter than the midday Sunday. Week after week, she sat in her stall watching her spices rot, her cloth remain unsold, while customers lined up at Zara's table. Pride, once her crown, now felt like a weight pressing her into the ground. It cannot go on like this, Kunda hissed one evening to her nephews. If people will not believe my words, then they will believe the law. We will show them that Zara is nothing but a thief of land. The next week, Madame Kunda appeared before the village council. She arrived in bright cloth, her face painted with indignation. With a voice sharpened by years of commanding the market, she declared, the land by the river belongs to the community, yet Zara, that hunter's wife, has seized it for herself. She builds racks, she grows herbs, she gathers women as if she is a queen. Who gave her permission? She has no papers, no right. This is theft, and theft must be punished. The council murmured. The village clerk, a man with sly eyes who often favored those with wealth, nodded eagerly. It is true, elders. The land has no written deed in her name. Without such proof, her claim is invalid. Perhaps the market has been deceived all along. Whispers spread fast like fire through dry grass. Some villagers frowned, doubting Zara for the first time. Others avoided her gaze at the market, unwilling to be caught on the wrong side of power. Even some women from the cooperative grew anxious. What if they take the land back? Ao whispered one night as they sat around the fire. Zara listened quietly. Her heart pounded, but her face remained calm. She had expected envy to attack her. She had not expected it to come dressed in authority. Yet she knew one thing: silence had saved her before, but this time silence would not be enough. On the day of the council, hearing the square filled with villagers, Madame Kunda stood tall, her stall behind her, as though it were her throne. The clerk sat beside the elders, his smug smile already pronouncing judgment. Zara arrived not in grand clothes, but in her simple dress with Amara by her side, and the women of the cooperative behind her. She walked barefoot, her steps steady, her head high. The clerk rose. This woman has seized community land without permission. She builds, she trades, she profits. Without papers, without approval. Such arrogance must not stand. A murmur of agreement rose from Kunda's supporters. Zara waited until silence returned, then stepped forward. She carried with her not a paper but a folded piece of cloth. Carefully, she spread it on the council's table. Stitched into the fabric were symbols, old village patterns, the kind passed down through generations. This cloth, Zara said softly, was given in exchange for meat to old Musa, the farmer who owned the land. He could no longer work it. He gave me the right to use it. His word was his bond. And this cloth embroidered with his family's mark is proof. The elders leaned closer, studying the stitches. They recognized the patterns, the spirals of Musa's lineage, marks older than any clerk's ink. Elder Juma, his cane resting against his knee, spoke firmly. In our village, before papers and seals, there was the word and the witness. Musa's word stands, and his mark is before us. The clerk scowled. Marks on cloth are not law, but Juma turned his sharp gaze on him. Law is not only ink on paper, law is truth, and truth has witnesses. He gestured to the women standing behind Zara. One by one they stepped forward. Miriam testified how she had helped clear the land. Ao described how Musa himself had walked them to the field, placing his hand on the soil and saying, "Work it as your own." Even Amara, trembling, spoke up. I saw him give her the cloth. I was there. The square buzzed with voices. Some nodded in agreement, others whispered in disbelief. Madame Kunda's face tightened. She had expected Zara to shrink under accusation, but instead, Zara stood taller than ever. Her truth carried not by shouts, but by steady voices. The elders withdrew briefly, then returned. Juma lifted his hand. The council has decided. Zara's claim stands. The land by the river is hers to use by the right of Musa's word and the witness of our people. The council warns, let no one bring false accusations again, for envy does not plant and envy does not feed. A cheer broke out among the cooperative women. Zara bowed her head, her face calm, but her chest trembling with relief. But then Zara did something no one expected. She turned to Madame Kunda, her voice soft, but carrying across the square. You have tried to destroy me. You sent words, you sent men, and now you sent the law. But envy builds nothing. I invite you, Kunda, to join us. Learn with us. Work with us. There is room for more than one stall in this market. The crowd gasped. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others murmured admiration. Kunda's cheeks burned with humiliation. She spat on the ground and stormed away, her nephews scrambling after her. That evening, Zara returned to the river field. The women gathered around her, their eyes shining with pride. You have silenced them, Miriam said. No one can question you now. Zara shook her head gently. Truth does not silence forever. New storms will come. But remember, our strength is not in winning fights. Our strength is in building what no fight can destroy. She looked at Amara, who was stirring a pot of soap by the fire, her face glowing in the orange light. And what we are building here, Zara whispered, will last longer than rumors, longer than envy, longer than us. The smoke rose into the night sky, carrying with it not only the scent of herbs and fire, but also the quiet promise of justice, won not through vengeance but through dignity. And though Madame Kunda's rage still simmered in the shadows, Zara knew this victory had planted something even greater than land. It had planted faith in her women, in her village, and in herself. The rains returned once more heavy and relentless, beating against rooftops and flooding the narrow paths of Riverbend. Yet in Zara's yard, the smoke never ceased. Even when storms darkened the skies, her racks burned steadily, and her cooperative continued its rhythm. Women came each morning, children ran between the fires, and Amara no longer, just a timid orphan, moved with confidence, correcting younger girls on how to tie banana leaves without tearing them. Zara watched it all with a quiet pride. But time, like the river, carries all things forward. Baraka the hunter, who had once towered over Zara's life, was not the same man who had dragged her into the forest years before. The illness had broken his strength, and though he had recovered enough to walk, his body remained fragile. More than his body, his spirit seemed drained. He no longer barked orders with the same authority, no longer struck with the same careless cruelty. Instead, he sat by the doorway most evenings, his eyes following Zara as she worked silent, weighed down by a shame he could not put into words. It was on a gray morning when the clouds hung low and the air smelled of wet earth that Baraka's body finally gave out. Zara found him collapsed near the fire, his breath shallow, his eyes distant. She knelt beside him, cradled his head, and whispered, "Rest, Baraka. Your time has come." There was no anger in her voice, no bitterness, only a solemn peace. He exhaled one last time, and the sound slipped into the silence of the hut like a sigh returning to the forest. News of the hunter's death spread quickly. Some villagers expected Zara to celebrate, to spit on his grave, to rid herself of him with loud triumph. Others whispered she would abandon the hut and claim his land as her own. But Zara did neither. She chose the path of dignity. She washed his body with care, dressed him in clean cloth, and tied a scarf around his head. She placed beside him a small plate of flour, a cup of water, and a bundle of dried leaves. Rites whispered from the elders, not for grandeur, but for respect. She summoned 2 young men from the village to dig his grave, and she sent word to Baraka's brothers in distant settlements. When they arrived, she greeted them with coffee and cassava bread, offering no resentment, no accusations, only silence and strength. During the burial, some women whispered, "Why honor a man who never honored her? Why give him dignity he never gave?" But others, their eyes wet with tears, said softly, "This is greatness. This is what it means to rise above pain." Zara listened to neither praise nor doubt. She stood quietly as the last shovelful of earth was placed on the grave, her face calm, her heart lighter than it had been in years. After the burial, she gathered Baraka's brothers. "The land he left," she said, "is yours. Divide it among yourselves. Use it well." They stared at her in astonishment. One of them stammered, "But you have every right to keep it." Zara shook her head. "I do not need it. My inheritance is already built." Her words fell like a soft thunderclap. No one dared argue. They understood Zara had risen beyond inheritance, beyond vengeance. That evening, Zara returned to her hut, lit the fire, and boiled water for tea. Amara sat beside her, watching her in silence. "Why did you give the land away?" the girl finally asked. Zara smiled faintly. "Because land can be taken, but dignity cannot. What I have built with my hands, no one can erase." Her father now, an old man moving slowly with regret etched deep into his face, appeared at the burial as well. He lingered on the edge of the gathering too, ashamed to step forward yet too restless to leave. When Zahra saw him, she walked toward him with steady steps. He lowered his eyes, expecting anger, but Zahra only extended her hand, lifting him gently. "Stand, father," she said softly. "The past is heavy enough. Do not bow to it." His eyes filled with tears, but she did not wait for him to speak. Forgiveness had already been given, not in words but in the calmness of her gaze. From that day forward, Zahra's place in the village changed forever. She was no longer whispered about as the poor girl sold to a hunter, nor as the woman accused of charms. She became the example of resilience, the one who fed the father, who sold her, who healed the husband who hurt her, and who buried him with dignity when death came. At Moyo Market, people greeted her with lowered heads and softened voices. Even men who once mocked her walked with respect when she passed. Children tugged at her dress, asking questions about herbs, or simply wanting to hear her laugh. Women gathered around her stall, not only to buy but to learn, carrying notebooks to jot down what she taught about soap making, about herbs, about survival. The cooperative by the river blossomed. They built larger racks, expanded their soap-making pits, and even began crafting small clay jars for storing herbs and oils. Zahra introduced a new system. Each woman kept her share of earnings, but also contributed a portion to a communal pot. With that pot, they bought tools, seeds, and cloth, ensuring no one was left behind. For the first time, women in Riverbend stood tall with their own coins, their own trade, their own worth. And yet Zahra never sought glory. She did not raise her voice in the market or boast about her success. She remained the same, steady figure, hands, busy eyes, sharp heart, quiet. Her greatness lay not in noise, but in the silence that carried strength. Still memories lingered. At night when the fire burned low, Zahra sometimes sat alone, recalling the day she was carted away from her village like payment. She remembered the scarf that fell to the dirt, the cracked pot that led to a slap, the silence that once suffocated her. But she no longer remembered with pain, she remembered with clarity. Those moments had not destroyed her. They had carved her into who she had become. One evening, as the cooperative women packed up after a long day, Amara approached Zahra, her eyes filled with determination. One day she said, "I want to build my own racks, my own stall, like you." Zahra placed a hand on her shoulder. "And you will. But remember, child greatness is not in how much you own. It is in how much dignity you keep while you grow. Do not seek to be above others. Seek to walk with them." The girl nodded solemnly. In her eyes, Zahra saw the future not just of Amara, but of all the women who once bent under silence and now stood upright, their hands busy, their voices steady. As Zara watched the smoke curl into the evening sky, she felt a peace she had never known. She had buried the man who once denied her love, but she had not buried herself with him. She had instead planted something far greater, a legacy rooted in dignity and patience, in the quiet strength of a woman who had once been sold, but could never again be silenced. And the village watching her began to understand power is not in how loudly one shouts, nor in how much land one owns. True power is the ability to forgive without bowing, to build without boasting, and to teach without fear. Zara, the girl who had once left Riverbend in a broken cart, had returned not as a shadow, but as a light. The Cornlight Festival had always been the brightest night of the year in Riverbend. It was the time when fields gave thanks for their harvest, when music and laughter filled the air, and when the village remembered its roots through fire, food, and stories. But this year, the anticipation carried a new name whispered on everyone's lips, Zara. For the first time in living memory, the council had invited a woman, not a midwife or the wife of a chief, but Zara herself, to speak at the closing ceremony. Some villagers clapped with joy, others muttered uneasily. "What can she say that we don't already know?" one man grumbled. But beneath the doubt was a current of awe. Zara had become more than a market figure. She was a symbol of endurance, of dignity, reborn. The festival began as always with drums beating like thunder, with children dancing in painted faces, with stalls overflowing with cassava cakes, roasted maize, and spiced stews. Zara moved through the crowd, quietly dressed, simply in a deep blue cloth, her hair tied with a scarf Amara had embroidered. She carried no jewels, no signs of wealth, yet when she walked, people stepped aside, their eyes following her as though gravity itself shifted around her. When her name was called, Zara did not climb the wooden stage set beneath the cashew trees. Instead, she walked barefoot into the center of the circle where the fire blazed. She sat on the packed earth just as the storytellers of old had done, her face lit orange by the flames. The crowd fell silent. Even the drums quieted, as if the night itself leaned in to listen. Zara began not with grand declarations but with memory. Her voice was soft, yet each word carried weight. "I was once a girl sold like a sack of salt," she said, her eyes scanning the crowd. "No blessing, no dowry, only silence. They sent me away in a cart as if I were nothing more than debt. And I entered the forest believing I was less than even the clay pots my mother left behind." Gasps rose from the circle. Children clutched their mothers' skirts. Elders bowed their heads. But the forest, Zara continued, teaches differently. It does not shout, it whispers. It showed me that silence is not death, it can be soil. And soil grows roots if you are patient. She paused, letting the fire crackle between her words. "From silence I learned smoke. From pain I learned herbs. From loneliness I learned value. And from betrayal I learned dignity." Her eyes glistened as she spoke of the night she smoked her first strip of meat, of the herbs that healed Baraka's fever, of the coins she buried in clay pots behind her hut. She told them of Amara the orphan, who had become her apprentice, of the women who once bent their heads in shame, but now stood tall at the market, earning with their own hands. "I was not given a seat at the table," Zara said, her voice firming. "So I built my own fire, and others came to warm themselves by it. And that fire is what you see now, not just me, but us." She gestured to the women in the crowd, her cooperative sisters, who sat together with proud eyes. Tears streamed silently down some faces. A widow pressed a cloth to her eyes. Even men who had once mocked her felt their throats tighten. A small child, no more than 7, crept forward and tugged at Zara's dress. "Is it true," she asked in a trembling voice, "that you were poor?" Zara bent low, her eyes soft as she looked at the child. "Yes," she said gently, "I was poor, and in some ways I still am. But I am not empty. And no one," she paused, her gaze sweeping the circle, "no one should ever call you empty if your hands, your heart, and your spirit are still willing to rise." The crowd did not erupt in applause. Instead, a heavy silence settled over them, the kind of silence that comes when truth finds a home. Even the crickets seemed to hush, as though the earth itself bowed in reverence. That night, no more speeches were made. The elders, sensing the weight of what had been spoken, closed the ceremony with a nod to Zara, as if to say nothing more needs to be added. People walked home slowly, carrying her words like embers in their chests. In the days that followed, Zara's home transformed into more than a hut or a workplace. It became a refuge. Women came with notebooks, eager to learn recipes for soap remedies, for fevers, methods of smoking meat. Widows arrived simply to sit in her yard, soaking in her calm presence. Young men, once dismissive, lowered their eyes when they passed her stall, and children, laughing, called her Auntie Strength. Her father, old and fragile, came to festivals now, only to seek her in the crowd. He never asked forgiveness, shame had tied his tongue, but Zara always greeted him with a nod and a calm smile. She carried no bitterness, only the memory that she had survived, without hatred consuming her. Zara herself did not call herself a leader. She did not seek titles or honors, but the people followed her nonetheless. When she entered the market, voices softened. When she touched a basket, hands withdrew respectfully. When she laughed even softly, it was as though the whole square brightened. Amara, now taller, stood beside her at the stall, answering customers with confidence. "This soap will not crack your hands," she explained. "These herbs are good for chest pain." Zara watched her with pride, knowing the knowledge was taking root in the next generation. Years of pain had not made Zara bitter. Instead, they had turned her into something greater, a mirror for others to see their own strength. She taught not with resentment, but with patience. She did not wish others to suffer as she had. She only wished that no one else would suffer in silence. One evening, Zara sat on the porch, the smell of smoked meat and soap filling the air. The women of the cooperative laughed nearby. Amara sang softly as she worked, and children played by the riverbank. Zara closed her eyes and listened. The sound was no longer silence, no longer loneliness. It was life, full, rich, and rooted. The girl once sold as a debt had become the root of a new harvest. She had buried not just a man, but an entire history of pain, and in its place, she had planted dignity, which grew strong enough to shelter many. In the village once guilty of forgetting now remembered. They remembered her story not because she demanded it, but because it had become woven into their own lives. Zara was no longer just the hunter's wife, no longer the poor girl in the cart. She was the woman who returned with hands full, a heart unbroken, and a truth that would never again be silenced. That night, as the smoke from the racks curled into the starlit sky, the people of Riverbend understood the most powerful return is not the one shouted with drums and trumpets. It is the return made barefoot, steady, carrying nothing but dignity and changing everything. Zara's journey reminds us that true wealth is not measured in land, coins, or possessions, but in dignity, the one thing no one can take unless you surrender it. Life will bring storms, betrayal, poverty, envy, even violence. But just as Zara turns silence into soil, pain into knowledge, and loss into roots, so too can we choose what to grow from what wounds us. She could have allowed bitterness to define her. Instead, she chose patience, resilience, and forgiveness, building not only a livelihood, but a legacy for her people. And that is the lesson for all of us. When you rise, rise not in anger, but in strength. When you succeed, let your work speak louder than your words. And when you are hurt, remember that healing others is also a way to heal yourself. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? What time is it in your part of the world? Comment, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so we can continue bringing you stories of resilience, redemption, and the quiet power of dignity.